Russia is hitting at Ukraine both militarily and now even economically. This comes as the Kremlin has terminated a critical agreement. It's called the Black Sea Grain Agreement. The initiative previously allowed Ukraine to export its grain by sea despite a wartime blockade. So far, the grain deal had been key in keeping global food prices stable and even alleviate one element of the global fallout from the war, and that was food insecurity. Now, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres immediately called out Russia and said, and I quote, "The decision is deeply disappointing and will strike a blow to people in need everywhere." Now, it should be noted that the deal had allowed Ukraine to restart the export of millions of tons of grain that languished for months after the invasion of Russia. As Russia weaponized food, the decision hits the Ukrainian farmers the hardest. Meanwhile, the act has also rattled wheat markets and exposed vulnerable countries, including Africa, to the prospect of a new round of food insecurity. Here's how the Ukrainian president has reacted. We'll also bring you a significant reaction coming in from the United States.
Якщо якась там купка людей десь там в Кремлі вважає, що вони...
If some group of people in the Kremlin think that they have the right to decide whether there will be food on the tables of various countries like Egypt, Sudan, Yemen, Bangladesh, China, India or Turkey, then the world has the opportunity to show them that blackmail is not allowed to anyone. Everyone has the right to stability. Africa has the right to stability. Asia has the right to stability. Therefore, we all must ensure security and protection from Russian madness. The Black Sea Grain Initiative can and should continue to operate. If without Russia, then without Russia.
Може і повинна працювати і надалі. Якщо без Росії, то без Росії.
We urge the government of Russia to immediately reverse its decision. Meanwhile, the United States has and we will continue to work with other countries to enable both Russian and Ukrainian grain to reach the rest of the world, including by ensuring that our sanctions do not target, contrary to Russian propaganda, they do not target Russian food or fertilizer, and we will continue to support Ukraine's efforts to get that grain to markets that desperately need it, even if that's through other routes. A lot of work to be done here. This is a deeply regrettable and, as I said, a dangerous decision that we urge Mr. Putin to reverse. And I've seen nothing that proves causation here, that the strike on the bridge led to Putin's decision not to extend. He had already been leaning that way publicly. Now, I won't speak for him. If he has his own justification, he can do that. But I've seen nothing.
All right, and with that, let's now bring in my guest today. I'm joined in by Lester Munson, who's a senior fellow at the National Security Institute. Thank you so much, Lester, for joining in. Lester, Mr. Guterres has said that there is simply too much at stake in a hungry and hurting world. How will Russia's exit now impact global food insecurity, not just for countries like Ukraine, but parts of the world, even especially like Horn of Africa?
We're very likely to see much higher food prices around the globe. And of course, that's a tremendous concern for countries that don't have the economic flexibility to afford that. So developing countries, poor countries, countries that are fragile already are going to suffer the most potentially from this development. But it's not just poor countries. In addition to grain exports, there's also a lot of agricultural inputs, such as fertilizer, that are dependent upon this Black Sea Agreement. Those are going to be impacted as well. So this, the impact of this decision potentially affects all kinds of countries, not just poor countries, but also middle-income countries.
Lester, Ukraine is ready with alternate routes, but why are they not potentially viable options?
Well, they are potentially viable, but they are more expensive and more limited. So we're, if Ukraine is not allowed, is not able to use exports by sea, and is going to have to look to exports by land, by train or truck or that kind of thing, that's much more expensive, much more limited. So we're still going to see a tremendous impact potentially on the world economy here.
Lester, Russia said that Ukraine's failure to export more grain to poorer countries was one of the reasons it pulled out of the deal, something that's been contradicted by the UN chief. What's the plausible reason for Russia's exit?
Russia's looking for sanctions relief for some of its financial institutions. The European Union kicked Russian banks out of the SWIFT system. The SWIFT system is a critical element to the global financial system, and without access to that, Russian banks are at a real disadvantage. That's unlikely to change, but that's probably the real reason behind what Moscow is doing here. It's much more than just the grain deal.
Right. Lester, last but not the least, Turkey's President Erdogan has said that Russia wants to continue the agreement and that they would discuss the renewal of the deal when they meet in person next month. Turkey and UN last year had jointly negotiated this deal. Can Erdogan help in renewing this deal again?
Well, we'll see. I hope he can. I hope he doesn't wait until next month. It would be nice to see some sort of compromise worked out in the next few hours, if not the next few days. So waiting until August, I think, would be a mistake. Where the prices of grain are already going up on world markets, we're likely to see that continue until some sort of accommodation is made here.
All right, Lester Munson, it was a pleasure having you on my show. Thank you so much for sharing in your precious inputs.
Pleasure.
And so as Russia pulls out of the Black Sea grain initiative, the United States has also slammed this decision, citing woes that emerged globally over food security. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken addressed the issue and said that Russia's decision to halt participation in the year-old deal that lets Ukraine export grain through the Black Sea was unconscionable and called for the pact to be restored as quickly as possible. Here's more.
The bottom line is it's unconscionable.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken blasted Russia's decision on Monday to halt participation in the year-old deal that lets Ukraine export grain through the Black Sea, calling for the pact to be restored as quickly as possible.
So the result of Russia's action today, weaponizing food, using it as a tool, as a weapon in its war against Ukraine, will be to make food harder to come by in places that desperately need it. This should be restored as quickly as possible. And I hope that every country is watching this very closely.
The move by Moscow came just hours after it said a, quote, terrorist attack struck a strategic bridge linking the Russian mainland to Russian-occupied Crimea. But Russian officials denied that prompted them to quit the grain deal. The Black Sea grain agreement was brokered by the UN in Turkey in July last year to alleviate a global food crisis worsened by Russia's February 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine and Russia are some of the world's biggest exporters of grain and other foodstuffs, and any interruption could drive up food prices across the globe. At a meeting of the UN Security Council, British Foreign Secretary James Cleverly also condemned Russia's termination of the Black Sea grain initiative.
Let us be clear. Russia's actions are taking food out of the mouths of the poorest people across Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. We cannot allow this war to go on for another 500 days.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said he has written to Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan and UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, calling for the continued operation of the Black Sea grain shipment deal without Russia's participation.
I am so sorry to say that today Russia has refused to prolong this deal. And this is something very serious that will create a lot of troubles to many people around the world. We, from our side, we will do everything we can through our solidarity lanes in order to make available the Ukrainian grain for the people who eat from it. And I have to blame Russia for this decision, completely unjustified, weaponizing the hunger of the people.
This Black Sea grain deal, agreed under the auspices of Antonio Guterres, is very important, especially for the most vulnerable countries, because this agreement, together with the European solidarity lanes, it is helping to make sure that the most vulnerable countries have access to the grains and to the fertilizers they need for the people, for the population. And that's why we fully support all the efforts of Antonio Guterres to make sure that the continuity of this agreement will be guaranteed.